Welcome to the Futuristic Adventures story. Here you find the best HFY story written by human. Listen the story. If you like it, subscribe to channel.
The sleek diplomatic shuttle hummed softly as it descended through the violet-hued skies of Zur-9 the planets. Twin suns bathed the sprawling crystalline city below in shimmering gold and silver light towers of translucent stone spiraled into the heavens, reflecting the glow like a city carved from starlight hovering platforms. Zipped through the air carrying Zoran citizens adorned in elegant robes woven from iridescent threads, it was a world of beauty, sophistication, and tradition, one that Doran Vane, a human diplomat, had been sent to foster relations with. Doran adjusted his collar, exhaling sharply as the shuttle touched down on the royal landing platform. The Zorian delegation waited just beyond the shimmering energy field that marked the entrance to the palace grounds. At the center of the group stood King Zorth, an imposing figure draped in regal white and gold robes, his sharp, angular features carved with an air of authority. Beside him, the royal advisor Vryn watched with a calculating gaze, but it was the woman standing just to the king's right who caught Doran's attention. She was mesmerizing, tall and poised princess. Zilara held herself with effortless grace. Her long silver-blue hair cascaded down her back in intricate braids, and her deep violet eyes shimmered with an intelligence that was both piercing and playful. Her attire was woven with luminescent patterns that subtly shifted with her movements, as if the very fabric of her dress was alive. Doran had read about Zorian beauty, but nothing had prepared him for the sheer presence she commanded. As the shuttle doors hissed open, Doran stepped forward, feeling the weight of 100 eyes on him. His orders were simple: establish peaceful diplomatic relations, ensure trade. Discussions proceeded smoothly, and most importantly, make a good first impression. He strode toward the royal family, forcing a confident smile. When he reached the appropriate distance, he bowed slightly, a gesture of respect on most intergalactic worlds. King Zorth gave a slow nod, his expression unreadable. You are welcome to Ziffer-9. Ambassador Vey, the king said, his voice deep and commanding. Thank you, your majesty. It's an honor to be here, Doran replied. He could feel the tension in the air, a silent scrutiny from the gathered nobles, as if they were waiting for something. Then turning to the princess, he did what any human would consider polite. He extended his hand for a handshake. A ripple of gasps tore through the court. The sound was so sudden, so sharp, that Doran instinctively froze. His hand still extended. The guards flinched, their hands twitching toward their weapons. Nobles murmured, their expressions ranging from shock to outright horror. Even the ever-composed advisor Vin widened his eyes in disbelief. Thera, for her part, simply stared at his outstretched hand. Her lips parted slightly. Doran blinked. What the hell had just happened? Before he could retract his hand, the princess, to everyone's astonishment, accepted it. Her fingers were cool and smooth against his palm, but her grip was firm, deliberate. The silence that followed was deafening. Then King Zorth stood abruptly. The motion was so forceful that the ornate gold-trimmed cloak draped over his shoulders billowed like a storm cloud. His eyes burned with an intensity that sent a chill down Doran's spine. Ambassador Vane, the king intoned, his voice laced with a dangerous edge. Do you understand what you have just done? Doran hesitated, his mind racing. Was it offensive to touch royalty? Did Zorian consider handshakes an insult? I meant no disrespect, he said carefully. On Earth, this is simply a greeting, a way of showing good will. King Zorat's expression darkened and murmurs spread like wildfire through the court. Vin stepped forward, his tone clipped and urgent. Ambassador, on Zur-9, a handshake between an unmarried royal and an outsider is not a mere greeting. He exhaled sharply, as if the very words pained him. It is a formal declaration of intent to father. Her hairs. Doran's stomach dropped. Wait, no, that couldn't be right. He turned back to Zilara, expecting her to protest, to laugh it off, to say this was some kind of joke. Instead, she tilted her head, slightly, considering him with open curiosity. You did not know? She asked, her voice like silk woven with amusement. Of course I didn't know, Doran hissed under his breath. King Zorth clenched his fists. Ignorance does not change the law. You have made a declaration, and it has been accepted his gaze burned into Doran, like a sun about to go supernova by the sacred traditions of our people. You must fulfill what you have begun. Doran could barely process the words. This was a first contact diplomatic mission. He was supposed to negotiate trade agreements, build alliances, not this. There had to be a way out, some loophole, Your Majesty. Doran began forcing his voice to remain calm. Surely there is a way to undo this misunderstanding. The court broke into whispers again, some looking scandalized, others entertained by the spectacle. King Zorat's eyes narrowed. You insult my daughter by suggesting you would reject her. Doran's brain screamed at him to be careful, to tread lightly. The last thing he needed was to start an intergalactic war over an accidental handshake. I would never insult the princess, he said quickly. I'm only asking if there's a way to. There is a way, Vin interjected, stepping between them. The advisor's sharp gaze flicked toward Zara, who had yet to say whether she even wanted this union. If he proves himself unworthy, the bond may be revoked. Doran nearly sagged in relief. Finally, a way out then. King Zorth smirked. It was not a friendly smirk. Very well, the king said, his voice dripping with challenge. Let him face the trials of worthiness. Doran's stomach clenched. He had no idea what that meant, but from the gleam in the king's eyes, he knew one thing for certain: he was so screwed. Doran stood frozen in place, his mind struggling to process the insanity of the situation. Just minutes ago, he had been a respected ambassador on a diplomatic mission. Now he was being accused of making a lifelong commitment to alien princess, all because of a handshake. The murmurs of the court buzzed in his ears, a mixture of shock, amusement, and intrigue. The nobles of Jur 9, draped in their shimmering robes, exchanged knowing glances, some whispering behind their hands, while others looked at Doran as if he were an exotic specimen who had just walked into a trap he couldn't see. King Zorth's intense gaze remained locked on him. The weight of the king's authority pressed down on Doran like a planet's gravity, making it clear that the Zorian monarch wasn't in the habit of repeating himself. Trials of worthiness. Doran finally managed to say, his voice a touch too high for his own liking. That sounds vague. Maybe we should go over some details before I agree to anything. Zora's violet eyes sparkled with amusement, though her expression remained composed. You seem nervous, Ambassador. Are the trials not to your liking, princess? I don't even know what they are. Doran shot back before realizing that snapping at royalty probably wasn't the best diplomatic move. He took a deep breath and exhaled slowly, forcing himself to stay calm. Look, I respect your traditions, but this is clearly a misunderstanding. There has to be another way to handle this besides throwing me into some alien obstacle course. Then the royal advisor cleared his throat. The law is absolute. An outsider who initiates the sacred bond, whether knowingly or unknowingly, must either see it through or prove themselves unworthy to refuse. Both is to dishonor the royal family. Doran rubbed his temples, and dishonoring the royal family would mean exile from Ziffer 9 Feldrin, stated matter-of-factly, and quite possibly from all Zorian allied territories. Your people would not take kindly to such a diplomatic failure. I presume. Doran groaned internally. This wasn't just about him anymore. If he botched this, it could damage intergalactic relations. King Zorat's voice boomed through the throne room. Once more, the trials will determine whether you are worthy of standing by my daughter's side. If you succeed, you will be recognized as her chosen mate. If you fail, well, let us just say the matter will be settled. Doran didn't like the way the king phrased that last part, Your Majesty. He tried again, attempting one last thread of reason. Would it not be easier to simply amend this law? Perhaps an exception could be made for diplomatic misunderstandings. The court gasped at his words, as if he had just suggested rewriting the fabric of reality itself. King Zorth's expression turned to stone. The laws of Zur 9 are not so easily changed. Human right, of course not. Doran muttered under his breath. Solara stepped forward, tilting her head slightly as she studied him. You are quite resistant to the idea, Ambassador. Is the thought of being my mate so unappealing? Doran's brain short-circuited. He opened his mouth to respond, then promptly shut it. This was a trap, wasn't it? There was no right answer here. That's not, I mean, it's not about you, he blurted, which somehow made it sound worse. You're clearly a very impressive woman, But this isn't exactly how humans go about relationships, Solera smirked. And yet you initiated the bond of Heirs with a simple handshake. Perhaps your customs are not so different from ours after all. Doran groaned. I swear that was not my intention. Intent is irrelevant. The king said coldly, the AT has been done. You will either rise to the challenge or remove yourself from our world in disgrace. Doran ran a hand down his face. This was really happening. He was really being forced to prove himself as a worthy suitor for an alien princess, one he had met mere minutes ago, all because of a stupid handshake. Fine, he said at last, his voice heavy with reluctant acceptance. What exactly do these trials of worthiness involve? King Zorat's eyes gleamed, as if he had been waiting for that question. You will face 3 trials, each designed to test the qualities required of a royal consort. Strength, intelligence, endurance. Doran pinched the bridge of his nose. Of course, because why settle things with a conversation when we could have a dangerous series of tests? Instead, Solera chuckled softly. You truly are unlike any suitor I have ever had, Ambassador Vane. Yeah, well, I didn't ask to be one, he muttered. King Zorth ignored him. Your first trial begins at dawn. You will face the Zoran apex beast in the ceremonial arena, and if you survive, we will proceed to the next challenge. Doran blinked. If I survive, Vin gave him a pitying look. Few have. Doran turned to Zalara. Would now be a good time to point out that humans don't usually wrestle alien monsters as part of their dating rituals. She gave him an almost mischievous smile. Then I suppose we shall see. How will you adapt to Zorian traditions? Doran sighed. This is so not how I thought today was going to go. Doran paced back and forth in the luxurious guest chamber he'd been given, running his hands through his hair as he muttered to himself. Outside the tall crystalline windows, Ur9's twin sons had begun their slow descent, casting long violet shadows across the cityscape. Somewhere in the distance, the hum of hovering platforms and the faint murmur of the city's people drifted through the air, but Doran barely registered any of it. His mind was consumed with one singular horrifying thought. He was going to have to fight an alien apex predator at dawn. Okay, he breathed, stopping to lean against an ornate pillar. Leighton, go over this again. I shook a princess's hand. Apparently that means I agreed to father her kids. The king is making me go through trials of worthiness to prove myself, and the first one is what gladiator combat. Doran let out a laugh, short, bitter, and entirely devoid of humor. This has to be a nightmare. Yep, I'm still asleep on the shuttle, drooling on my uniform, and any second now I'll wake up. And a sudden chime echoed through the chamber, cutting off his rambling. The large silver doors slid open with a whisper, revealing the last person than he expected. Princess Zalara stepped inside, her expression unreadable. The soft glow from the bioluminescent patterns on the walls illuminated her form, casting an ethereal shimmer over her silver blue hair. Doran straightened immediately. A princess? I wasn't expecting a visit. Zalara approached gracefully, her hands folded in front of her. I thought it only fair to check on you. It seems you are under considerable stress. Doran scoffed. Stress? No stress is when you're running late for a meeting. This is full-blown catastrophic intergalactic disaster level panic. He waved his hands dramatically. Do you realize how insane this situation is? I don't even know what I'm fighting tomorrow. Zora studied him for a moment, then casually leaned against the edge of a nearby chaise, the faintest trace of amusement in her gaze. You will be facing the Vorian apex beast. Doran groaned, dragging a hand down his face. That doesn't sound remotely reassuring. It is a noble creature, Zalara said, tilting her head slightly. 4M tall, thick armored hide, razor-sharp mandibles. Quite difficult to kill, though not impossible. Doran gaped at her. 4M mandibles? You're telling me I have to go toe-to-toe with an alien death crab? Zara's lips twitched as if she was holding back a smile. You exaggerate. The Vorian is not a crab. It is more of a— she searched for the word— reptilian predator. With exoskeletal plating, it is highly territorial, but with the right tactics, you may subdue it without fatal injuries. May subdue it? Doran echoed flatly. Great. Just great. He turned away, placing his hands on his hips. As he stared out the window, his reflection stared back at him, disheveled, exhausted, and not at all ready to face An alien monster in less than 12 hours. Zilara regarded him for a long moment. Before speaking again, her voice softer this time. "You wish to leave, do you not?" Doran turned back, caught off guard by the sudden change in her tone. "I mean," he started, rubbing the back of his neck, "it's not that you're not impressive, princess. I just didn't exactly wake up this morning thinking I'd be engaged in an alien battle royale to prove my worth as a mate." He exhaled slowly. "This whole thing is a lot." Zara nodded, standing up. "I understand my father is bound by the laws of our people, but I do not require a mate who fears our ways." Doran frowned. "That's not—" He stopped himself. Was he afraid? Well, yes, obviously only an idiot wouldn't be, but was that really the issue? Zara stepped closer, and for the first time since this madness started, she looked at him, not as a princess, but as someone curious about the stranger caught in this whirlwind of tradition. "Do you truly wish to abandon this challenge, to return home and pretend this never happened?" Doran hesitated. Objectively, leaving would be the smart ch. He could walk away, let the diplomat smooth over the fallout, and go back to his normal life. But something about that idea didn't sit right. Maybe it was his stubbornness, maybe it was the thrill of proving he could handle the impossible, or maybe, just maybe, it was the way Zilara was looking at him now, not as some bumbling outsider, but as someone who might actually be worth something to her people. Finally, Doran let out a breath and straightened his shoulders. "I'm not running away." Sarah's expression softened. "Then I suppose you have a trial to prepare for." Doran let out a dry chuckle. "Right. Just need to figure out how to take down a 4-meter armored monster before sunrise." "No problem." Solara took a step toward the door, but hesitated. Then, almost as an afterthought, she turned back. "If you wish to impress my father, do not fight the Vorian with brute strength alone." Outsmarted. Doran blinked. "Wait, what does that mean? Do you have actual advice?" "Maybe a weak spot." Solara smirked. "You are clever. I'm sure you'll figure it out." And with that, she walked out, leaving Doran standing there more confused than ever. He exhaled and muttered to himself, "Yeah, I'm so going to die tomorrow." The moment Doran stepped into the ceremonial arena, he knew he was in trouble. The arena was massive, an open-air coliseum carved from dark Zorian stone, with towering walls that shimmered faintly under the alien suns. Thousands of spectators filled the stands, nobles, warriors, scholars, and civilians alike, all gathered to witness the fate of the outsider who had dared to touch their princess. At the far end of the arena, King Zorth sat upon his elevated throne, flanked by advisors and warriors in gleaming ceremonial armor. Zilara sat beside him, her expression unreadable, though Doran thought he caught the faintest trace of concern in her violet eyes. The air was thick with anticipation. Then the massive gates at the far end of the arena groaned as they slid open. Doran's stomach sank from the shadows beyond the gate. A deep guttural snarl echoed through the Colosseum. The sound alone made his instinct scream at him to run. And then it appeared. The Vorian apex beast lumbered forward, its armored hide gleaming like polished obsidian, its 6 powerful limbs moving with an eerie combination of grace and brute strength. Its reptilian face was lined with jagged mandibles, and its piercing gold eyes locked onto Doran like a predator sizing up its next meal. The crowd roared in excitement. Doran exhaled sharply. "Right, just a giant alien death lizard, nothing to worry about." A deep voice boomed through the arena, amplified by unseen technology. "Let the trial begin." The moment the words were spoken, the van let out a deafening screech and charged. Doran barely had time to react. He dove to the side just as the beast's massive clawed limbs slammed into the ground where he had been standing, sending up a spray of dust and debris. "Nope." Doran yelped, scrambling to his feet. "Nope, nope, nope." The beast pivoted with shocking speed, its golden eyes narrowing as it lunged again. This time Doran was faster. He rolled beneath its swiping claws, barely avoiding being skewered. The crowd gasped in delight. Doran knew one thing for certain: if he tried to go head-to-head with this thing in brute force, he was dead. Zora's words echoed in his mind. "Do not fight the Vorian with brute strength alone." Outsmarted. Easier said than done. Doran quickly assessed his surroundings. The arena was mostly barren, Except for a few towering stone pillars positioned around the battlefield, not much cover, but maybe, just maybe, something he could use. The van lunged again, this time instead of dodging Doran. Ran. The crowd erupted in laughter. The human fleas. Someone shouted. Doran ignored them. He sprinted toward the nearest stone pillar, the beast thundering after him. Just as the van lunged, Doran twisted at the last second, planting a foot against the pillar and launching himself to the side. The beast, unable to stop its momentum, slammed head first into the stone with a thunderous crack. The crowd gasped. Doran didn't waste time. He sprinted toward another pillar, glancing over his shoulder as the van shook off its daze, its golden eyes burning with rage. It came at him again, faster this time. Doran's mind raced. He needed to be smarter. That's when he noticed something. The way the beast moved, how its armored plating shifted as it turned. Its exoskeleton was nearly impenetrable, except there, right at the base of its neck, a small gap in the armor. When it stretched its limbs, a weakness. Doran grinned. Gotcha. The beast lunged again. But this time, Doran was ready. He feinted left, drawing it in, then suddenly changed direction and sprinted straight at it. The crowd gasped at the last possible second. Doran dropped into a slide, barely ducking beneath the beast, snapping mandibles as he passed under it. He thrust his arm upward, striking hard at the exposed gap beneath its neck. The van roared in pain, its entire body convulsing. It staggered backward, dazed, its limbs struggling to support its own weight. Doran didn't hesitate. He scrambled to his feet, grabbed a fallen piece of broken stone, and with every ounce of strength he had slammed it into the same vulnerable spot. The beast let out one last guttural snarl before its legs buckled. Then, with a final shudder, it collapsed. Silence fell over the arena for a long, breathless moment. No one spoke. Then the Colosseum erupted in cheers. Doran, panting and covered in dust, staggered back, staring at the motionless creature. Holy, I actually won! A deep chuckle rumbled through the Colosseum, drawing Doran's attention to the royal balcony. King Zorth's expression was unreadable, but there was something in his gaze. Approval. The first trial has been conquered, the announcer declared. Doran barely had time to process what was happening before two armored guards approached, motioning for him to step forward. He wiped a hand across his face. What now? One of the guards smirked. Now, human, you face the next trial. Doran was exhausted, his body ached from the fight with the van, and every breath he took felt like it rattled his ribs. Yet as he stood in the center of the arena, sweat dripping down his face, he barely had a moment to recover before the second trial was announced. The king rose from his throne, his deep, commanding voice echoing across the Colosseum. You have proven yourself in battle, outsider, but strength alone does not make a worthy mate for my daughter. The second trial will test your mind, your ability to navigate the labyrinth of Zenth. The crowd murmured with excitement, and Doran barely resisted the urge to groan. A labyrinth, really, he muttered under his breath. Great. So we're just hitting every fantasy trope in the book. Two guards stepped forward and gestured for him to follow. With one last glance at the fallen van, he let himself be led out of the arena and down a long corridor beneath the Colosseum. The deeper they went, the colder and darker it became, until the stone halls finally opened into a massive underground chamber, and there it was, the labyrinth of Zenth. It stretched out before him, a maze of towering walls made from smooth, polished stone that shimmered faintly under the dim blue glow of the caverns. Crystals, strange symbols, were etched into the walls, pulsating softly, as if they were alive. The air smelled different here, charged with something unnatural. Doran turned to one of the guards. All right, Leighton, hear it? Whack the catch. The guard smirked. The labyrinth is alive. Doran blinked. Come again. The walls shift, paths open and close. It will. Time moves differently within. You must reach the center and retrieve the heart of Zenth. If you fail to do so before the sands in this hourglass run out, he held up a long, ornate hourglass filled with glittering white sand, you will be lost forever. Doran stared at the hourglass, then at the entrance of the labyrinth. He exhaled sharply. Fantastic love, that definitely not terrifying at all. The guard stepped aside, and the heavy stone door groaned open, revealing a narrow corridor beyond. Doran swallowed hard and stepped inside. The moment he crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind him, and the labyrinth breathed. The very walls around him seemed to shift, undulating like living flesh, before settling into a completely different configuration. Doran took a step back. Oh, that's unsettling. There was no going back now. With a sigh, he moved forward, carefully making his way down the twisting path. At first the corridor seemed normal enough: stone walls, eerie blue light, total silence. But then he turned a corner and found himself standing in a completely different corridor than the one he had just entered. He frowned. Okay, so the walls really do move. He tried marking the path with a small rock, but the moment he looked away and turned back, the rock was gone. Doran let out a slow breath. All right, think there has to be a way to beat this. He closed his eyes, trying to focus. If this place was alive, if it reacted to him, then maybe it wasn't just about walking through. Maybe it was a puzzle. He touched one of the glowing symbols on the wall. It pulsed under his fingers, and suddenly the ground beneath him shifted. The entire hallway stretched outward, reforming itself. Doran grinned. Now we're getting somewhere. He continued forward, testing different symbols as he moved. Some led to dead ends, others transported him back to where he started. But little by little, he began to understand the labyrinth's rhythm. He wasn't walking through it, he was shaping it. Minutes passed, maybe hours. Time was impossible to measure here, but eventually he found himself standing before a large stone pedestal at the labyrinth's center, and there it was, the heart of Zinthus, a glowing crystalline sphere hovering just above the pedestal, pulsating with a soft, golden light. Doran approached cautiously. All right, no traps, no sudden death beams. Nothing. He reached out and carefully lifted the heart from its resting place. For a moment, everything was silent. Then the labyrinth screamed. The walls shuddered violently, the floor cracking beneath his feet. The very air became heavier, like the entire structure was collapsing in on itself. Doran cursed. Of course, it's not that easy. He spun around and sprinted back the way he came, but the paths were no longer the same. The corridors shifted faster now, violently rearranging themselves in an attempt to keep him trapped. He was running out of time. Then he spotted it, a faint glow in the distance, the entrance. With every ounce of strength he had left, Doran ran. The walls groaned, the floor crumbled, but he didn't stop. Just as the final corridor closed behind him, he leaped forward and tumbled out onto solid ground. The heavy stone door slammed shut behind him, sealing the labyrinth once more. Doran lay on his back, gasping for breath, the glowing heart of Zinthus still clutched in his hand. Silence. Then a slow clap echoed through the chamber. Doran lifted his head to see King Zorth standing there, arms crossed, an expression of grudging approval on his face. Zalara stood beside him, her lips pressed together, as if she were trying to suppress a smile. You have completed the second trial, the king declared. You are more resourceful than I expected, outsider. Doran pushed himself up with a groan. Yeah, well, if you wanted to see how good I was at running for my life, you could have just chased me through the palace with a stick. Zalara let out a soft laugh. The king, however, merely nodded. 2 trials remain. Rest while you can. Human. Doran exhaled heavily. Right, because that's been so easy so far. As he was led away to recover, he caught Zora's gaze one last time, and for the first time since this insanity started, he thought he saw something else in her eyes, something dangerously close to admiration. Doran sat on the edge of a stone bench, rubbing his sore shoulders, his body ached from the fight with the van, and his mind was still reeling from the labyrinth. The heart of Zinthus had been taken away for verification, or whatever royal nonsense they needed to do. And now he was left in a quiet chamber somewhere beneath the Colosseum, given food and water, and told to rest. He wasn't sure if he could. His mind kept replaying everything, how he had gotten himself into this insane situation, how close he had come to failing, and yet he was still here. He was still standing. The heavy stone doors creaked open, and Doran turned his head just as Zalara stepped inside. She was alone for a moment. She just stood there, studying him. Then, with slow, deliberate steps, she approached. Her long silver blue hair flowed behind her, and her regal posture never wavered, but there was something softer about her expression now. Doran raised an eyebrow. Let me guess, you're here to tell me the next trial is a death race against a teleporting murder cat, or something? Zara tilted her head. Numbered not this time, she sat down beside him, the cool scent of her presence filling the space between them. For a few moments neither of them spoke. Then she said, "You were not supposed to make it this far." Doran snorted. "Yeah, I figured that out when your father dropped a war beast on me." Zora's lips twitched. "He believed you would fail. He hoped you would, but you continue to surprise him." Doran leaned back against the bench, exhaling. "Well, if I knew shaking hands with a pretty girl would put me in a fight for my life, I might have worn a nicer shirt." Sarah's expression shifted just slightly, but it was enough for Doran to see something beneath her carefully controlled exterior. Amusement, curiosity, something else. "You do not seem afraid," she observed. "Oh, trust me," Doran said. "I'm plenty afraid, but at this point I think I'm too tired to care." He glanced at Hiru. "Really okay with all this, just letting your dad throw me into death traps because of some weird ancient law?" Zara hesitated. "It is tradition." "That's not an answer," Doran pointed out. She sighed, looking away. "My people value strength, survival, the ability to adapt. If you are to stand beside me, you must prove yourself in ways that they understand." Doran frowned. "You keep saying if like you don't actually believe this whole thing is set in stone." Zora's fingers traced along the edge of the bench. "I believe in duty," she said softly, "but I also believe that fate is not as rigid as my father thinks it is." Doran watched her for a long moment. He had been thrown into this mess with barely a chance to breathe, barely a chance to process. But as he sat beside her now, seeing the way her violet eyes flickered with something deeper than mere obligation, he realized she was trapped in this just as much as he was. "Zalara," he said, his voice quieter now, "what happens if I do pass all the trials?" She turned to look at him. "Then my father will have no choice but to accept you. And what if I don't want to be forced into this?" Zalara hesitated. "Then you must find a way to make him see another path." Doran sighed. "Right, because convincing a giant alien warlord to change his mind is so much easier than fighting monsters." Zalara actually smiled at that. "You are more resourceful than you appear, Doran. I have no doubt you will find a way." Before Doran could respond, the door opened again. A guard stepped inside, his expression unreadable. "His time," he announced. Doran groaned. "Of course it is." He pushed himself to his feet, stretching. "All right, what's next? Do I have to outdrink an alien warlord, wrestle a space dragon, solve a riddle that'll melt my brain?" The guard simply gestured for him to follow. Doran sighed and turned back to Zalara. "You're not going to give me a hint, are you?" She just stood, straightened her shoulders, and said, "Survived." "Not exactly comforting." Doran shook his head and followed the guard through the stone corridors, his mind already racing. He had won 2 trials. He had survived longer than anyone expected, but something told him the hardest part was yet to come. The chamber Doran was led into was unlike the others. It wasn't an arena, nor a battlefield, nor a shifting maze of death. It was a vast, open hall, its high ceilings carved with intricate alien symbols that pulsed faintly with golden light. At the center of the room stood a circular platform, its edges lined with glowing stones, and waiting for him there was King Zorth. Zora stood beside her father, her face unreadable, her hands clasped in front of her. Surrounding the chamber were elders, distinguished ancient figures draped in ceremonial robes, their piercing eyes fixed on Doran. As he approached, something about this felt different. He wasn't about to fight. He wasn't about to run. This was something else entirely. Doran slowed his steps. "Okay, this doesn't look like another death trap, but at this point, I'm not ruling anything out." The king's deep voice echoed through the chamber. "You have proven strength in battle. You have demonstrated intelligence in the labyrinth. But the third trial," he gestured toward the glowing platform, "is the trial of the soul." Doran blinked. "Oh, that sounds existential." One of the elders, a woman with silver skin and piercing golden eyes, stepped forward. "The trial of the soul is a test of one's true essence. There is no deception within the circle of revealing it. Will strip away all pretense, all falsehoods, and show us your deepest truths." Doran shifted uncomfortably. "And by deepest truths you mean you will stand in the circle," the elder said simply, "and it will show us who you are." Doran stared at the platform, then at the serious expression surrounding him. "That's the trial?" he asked, incredulous. "No monsters, no explosions, no dodge the space laser Solara spoke, her voice calm but firm. "It is more dangerous than you think." Doran hesitated. He wasn't afraid exactly, but something about this unsettled him. He had no idea how this worked, what it would reveal. What if it showed them something he didn't even know about himself? What if it showed something that would make them reject him outright? But what choice did he have? With a slow breath, Doran stepped forward onto the glowing platform. The moment his foot touched the stone, the entire chamber hummed. The runes on the walls flared to life, the air around him suddenly thick with unseen energy. A warm warmth crawled up his spine, wrapping around him like an invisible force. Then the world vanished. Doran blinked. He was no longer in the chamber, no longer standing in the circle. He was somewhere else, a place of endless space, swirling lights and shifting colors. Stars shimmered in the distance, constellations rearranging themselves as if they were alive. And then he saw them, reflections of himself. Not mirrors, not illusions, versions. One Doran was younger, wider-eyed, full of hope, wearing the uniform from his old life on Earth. Another was battle-worn, scared, carrying weapons. He didn't recognize his eyes, filled with a cold determination that sent a chill down his spine. Yet another Doran looked different. Older, regal, standing beside Solara, wearing clothes that resembled those of the Zorian nobility. And then there was one more, a Doran standing alone, staring into the void, his face blank. Doran swallowed hard. "Okay," he muttered, "I hate this." The reflections turned toward him. "You are at a crossroads," a voice boomed. Not from any one reflection, but from all of them. At once, the path you walk will decide the fate of more than just yourself. Doran clenched his fists. "Yeah, and what exactly am I supposed to choose?" The reflections shifted their forms, distorting the warrior, the voice intoned, and the battle scar. Doran stepped forward. "One who will carve his place through war and conquest, who will fight for honor and claim power beyond imagination." The ruler, the regal Doran, stepped forward. "One who will embrace destiny, stand beside the princess, and shape the fate of an empire." The wanderer, the lone Doran moved next. "One who will reject all bonds, seek his own path, and leave this world behind." Doran took a step back, his pulse quickening. "You're telling me I have to pick one of these?" The voice was neither kind nor cruel. "You must choose who you truly are. And if you lie, the circle will know." Doran's heart pounded. The warrior, the ruler, the wanderer, three futures, three versions of himself. But as he stared at them, something felt wrong. This wasn't the whole truth, because deep down Doran knew he wasn't just one of these things. He wasn't just a warrior or a ruler or a wanderer. He was just him. He took a deep breath, and then he rejected all three. "I'm not any of these," he said firmly. "I don't know what I'm supposed to become, and I sure as hell don't have some grand destiny figured out." His eyes narrowed. "But what I do know is that I'm not letting anyone else decide it for me." The reflections flickered. The space around him trembled. Then a shattered. Doran gasped as the visions dissolved, the swirling cosmos folding inward. The pressure around him lifted, and in an instant he was back in the chamber. The glowing rooms dimmed, the energy in the air dissipated. Doran stood breathless at the center of the platform. Silence filled the hall. Then King Zorth laughed, a deep resounding sound that echoed through the chamber like rolling thunder. "You are either the most foolish man I have ever seen," the king rumbled, "or the bravest." Doran, still dazed, rubbed his temple. "Gee, to be honest, I'm not sure which one either," the elders murmured among themselves. Zora's gaze lingered on him, her expression unreadable, but there was something new in her eyes now. "Respect, very well," the king said at last. "You have passed the third trial." Doran exhaled sharply. "Awesome, great, super fun. By the way, big fan of having my soul dissected by space magics." Solara actually smiled, but Doran barely had time to process his relief before the kink expression hardened. "Tomorrow," he declared, "you will face the final trial." The chamber fell silent again. Doran sighed. "Of course I will," because somehow he already knew the final trial. It would be the hardest one. Yet Doran stood in the center of the Grand Coliseum once more. This time there were no shifting mazes, no towering war beasts, no glowing circles of soul-revealing magic. There was only King Zorth, the massive alien warlord, stood at the far end of the arena, his heavy cloak Billowing his golden armor reflecting the sunlight in his hand, he held a weapon, a long curved blade forged from a metal that shimmered with an otherworldly glow. The entire Zoran court watched in silence, the crowd, the elders, the royal guards, all waited breathless. For what was to come, Zilara stood at the edge of the Colosseum, her face unreadable. Doran let out a slow breath. "So let me guess," he said, loud enough for the entire arena to hear. "This is the part where I fight you to the death." The king's deep voice boomed. "It is the final trial." Doran exhaled. Of course, it is. He should have expected it. He had fought beasts, solved puzzles, survived mind-melting magic. There was no way Zorth was going to let him win without proving himself against him directly. Zorth lifted his blade. "If you wish to stand beside my daughter, you must prove yourself worthy with your own strength." Doran looked down at his own hands. He had been given a weapon, a shorter blade, simple, unadorned. He turned it over in his palm. Then he looked up at the towering alien warlord. He knew the truth. He knew there was no beating Zorth in a fair fight. The Zorian king was a seasoned warrior, a living legend who had won countless battles before Doran had even been born. And yet Doran had to win. He had no choice. The air grew heavy. As the crowd waited for the first strike, Doran tightened his grip. Zorth charged. The king moved with terrifying speed, closing the distance. In an instant, Doran barely managed to twist out of the way, the king's blade slicing through the air. Where he had just stood, Doran staggered back. "Okay, cool. So we're just going full speed immediately. No warm-up." Zorth didn't answer. He swung again. Doran barely ducked, rolling away as the blade slammed into the ground, cracking the stone beneath them. His heart pounded. He could feel the weight of thousands of eyes on him. He needed a plan. He couldn't win by brute force. He couldn't win in a straightforward duel. But what if he didn't fight like a warrior? What if he fought like himself? Doran shifted his stance. Instead of trying to match the king's power, he dodged. He let Zorth strike first, again and again. And every time, Doran twisted, ducked, evaded just in time. The king's strikes were fast, precise, but Doran was faster. The crowd murmured. The longer the fight went on, the more obvious it became. Doran wasn't winning by overpowering Zorth. He was outlasting him. Zorth was stronger, but Doran was relentless. He wouldn't fall, he wouldn't break, and slowly, very slowly, Zorth's movements began to slow. Doran saw his opening. The next time the king swung, Doran stepped, twisted behind him, and in one fluid motion pressed his blade lightly against Zorth's back. The arena fell silent. Zorth froze. Doran exhaled, voice steady. "Looks like I win." For a long, tense moment, nobody moved. Then the king laughed, a deep, resounding sound that shook the arena. Zorth turned, his golden eyes filled with something unexpected, not anger but pride. "You are clever," the king said, his voice like rolling thunder. "You do not fight like a warrior." Doran smirked. "Yeah, well, I'm not one." The king's gaze held his for a long moment. Then he lowered his blade. The crowd erupted into cheers. Doran barely had time to process what was happening before Zilara was suddenly standing before him. "You did it," she whispered. Doran, still catching his breath, let out a half laugh. "Did I, though? Because I feel like I just survived long enough to not die." Zilara smiled. "That is enough." She took his hand, and this time, when their fingers intertwined, there was no curse, no trial, only choice. King Zorth stepped forward, his voice carrying through the arena. "You have earned your place among us," he declared. "You are no longer an outsider. From this day forth, you are Zorian." Doran blinked. "Wait, does that mean I get a cool cape now?" Or Zilara laughed. The kink expression softened. "More than that, human. You have earned the right to stand beside my daughter." Doran looked at Zilara for the first time since this entire mess began. There was no pressure, no demand, only possibility. He laced his fingers with hers, squeezing gently. Then he said, a slow grin spreading across his face, "I guess I'll stick around." The cheers of the crowd rose around them. Zilara smiled, and just like that, Doran's fate was no longer forced upon him. It was his own.